It's the Christmas ornament video. I had originally thought that I would do a 12-sided dodecahedron object and do one of the 12 days of Christmas on each side, and then turn that into a sphere. And the idea was to make each of those graphics with a V-carve method. What that allows you is to get very fine detail within the graphic that you're carving, because you can use that point on the V-shaped bit. But I thought about it a bunch, and I decided that trying to do something like that with a sphere may not work as well as I was thinking it would. When the 12-sided object is turned into a sphere, you lose so much of the pointy parts that the depth of the carving has to be so deep that you don't lose it as you turn off the extra bit of material. So what I decided I would do is do 12 sort of simpler Christmas graphic things and then maybe add some detail with colored pencils. The first thing to do was to cut out the graphics I was going to inlay into the sphere. I have a piece of walnut that I'm going to use for the main body of the sphere, sort of the background or the field for the graphics. And I can start to cut out the spaces for the pieces of cherry that I cut out previously. I did one and then I checked to see how well it would fit. So I had to cut apart some of the cherry pieces. And I remembered to mirror these this time, so they'll go in top first. The piece that I'm cutting on the bandsaw will stick up. So I did a roughing pass first to get rid of most of the material, and then I could do a finishing pass and take off just a little bit of the outside. I think I ended up with 13 1/1000ths of an inch that I had to remove to get the pieces to fit. And I made them just a tiny bit less deep than the thickness of the cherry pieces. So the bottom would hit the bottom of the hole before the sides that I hadn't cut off hit the top of the walnut, if that makes sense. There's a wreath graphic that I couldn't cut the center out of on the bandsaw, so I drilled that out on the drill press. And that was really the only issue with this process, was I cut the center hole too big. I think I cut it on the wrong side, so the hole ended up being too big. So that piece I had to remake. Then I drilled a relief hole in the bottom of the holes that I had cut. So this will let the air out of the hole as I put the piece of cherry in. I've found with the glue and a really tight fit, it's oftentimes hard to get the piece in because there's a bubble of air on the bottom that's keeping it from going in. I can just put glue in and kind of paint it around and then put the piece in and tap it in a little bit with the mallet. And doing it this way, I don't have to clamp it. It's just held in place with how tight the fit is. I think on the gingerbread man, I didn't quite make the radiuses on two sides round enough, so they were too tight, and I had to adjust the cut slightly. That was a mistake in drawing the graphic. And put the Christmas tree in, and there's a candle that's just a rectangle. I took the graphics that I had drawn on the computer and I just offset them bigger a little bit, I think 1/4 of an inch. And then I could go and flatten the tops of all of the cherry pieces. The other way to do this would have been to have put a big wide cutter on the CNC and then just gone back and forth over the whole piece of walnut. Whereas this way I could leave the smaller bit in, then only cut where there was actually wood to be removed. So it feels more efficient, but whether it really was or not is debatable. I got a cheap set of colored pencils, and I needed to check how big the diameter was on the colored pencils. And as luck would have it, they were 0.28 inches, so slightly bigger than the 0.25 router bit, which was good. That meant I could just use the router bit I've been using and make holes that were slightly larger than the bit. Clean out the sawdust out of the holes. So with these, I also did a roughing pass, and then I went back and made them a little bit bigger. I was finding on the roughing pass it wasn't cutting the bottom as big around as the top. I think the bit's being stressed a little bit. So doing a finishing pass gave me more parallel sides all the way down the depth of the hole. So I would do one of the graphics and then check, make sure the holes were working, and then do the next one, and so on. So this took a little while doing all these holes, but I didn't encounter any major issues. The idea with the graphics was to do something simple as the inlay and then add some detail with the colored pencils. It's sort of a strategic colored pencil wood turning. I haven't had my dust collection hooked up to the router. It doesn't quite reach all the way to the 4th axis, which I've been using lately a little more. I'd like to try something different with the dust collection, and I haven't quite figured that out yet. Now that all the holes are drilled for the pencils, I need to cut the pencils into short lengths so that those can go into the holes. My first thought was to cut them on the table saw with the sled, and that worked, but it kind of spit the pencils all over the place. And as the pencil got shorter and shorter, it got harder and harder to hold them so close to the blade. Then I remembered I have my little trimming saw that I just got, and that seemed like the perfect thing to use for this, cutting small parts. And it worked, but I could really only do one at a time, and it was kind of slow. Then I tried the radial arm saw, and that worked pretty well, but I could really only do 1 or 2 at a time. And again, it got hard when I got down to the end of the pencil. Then I remembered the little bandsaw, and that's, I think, what the solution was to cut them on the bandsaw, and that's where I did most of the cutting. It was still 1 at a time, but I could do them very quickly, and I could do the end piece somewhat safely. And it didn't really matter how perfect or parallel the cut was to the pencil. Then I could put the pencils in. I found if I just put a blob of glue on the piece of pencil, I could put it in the hole and then rotate it a little bit and get sort of a little bead of glue around that seam. And then as I pushed the pencil in, that glue would cover the pencil and the inside of the hole. I didn't have to be so careful about putting the glue on. This is where I'm doing the stop motion, but it's with a different camera. Finishing up the Christmas lights. So that took quite a while doing all of the colored pencils. It was a little bit like painting, trying to decide which colors to put where. Then once the graphics are made, I can cut out the pentagons from the piece of walnut. And as this is a long piece, I did it in sections, and I would move my hold downs around as I did each section. And I didn't cut these all the way through, as I can pack them in a little tighter that way. And I don't have to worry about the piece of walnut losing its structural integrity as I cut the holes out of it. So before I do anything, I need to make a mirror image of this sled. This sled would cut the pentagons sort of upside down, so the outer face of the object faced down onto the sled, which works, but if I want to make a dodecahedron with any kind of inlays or any kind of bumps on that outer surface, I need to be able to cut the pentagons flipped over with the outer face facing up. So what I need to do is take this sled and mirror it so the pieces sit on this side of the blade, and the blade can tilt away, and that gives me a pentagon where the outer face of the dodecahedron faces up. If that makes sense. So I'm not going to make such a complicated sled. It'll just be about cutting the pentagons. I won't be making the triangles that make the pentagons. I can use this sled for doing that. I can attach the slides onto the bottom of the sled. I just put it in place and then put some screws in from above and then put more screws in from below. And I'm not going to worry too much about how square the back of the sled is, as the real function of the sled happens with the jigs that are in the middle of the sled. So I just attached a back and front fence. And I can take the parts for cutting the angles on the pentagons off the old jig. And I made the first cut on the new sled. And I cut it at the angle I'm going to need. And I can put the jig into place in the middle of the sled. And this went a lot quicker as everything was sort of made. I did have to turn all of the parts around and also flip a few of them over, as it's all a mirror image of the old sled. And it was at about this point I decided I needed one of my pentagons to kind of make sure I was putting everything together correctly, but also for the right size pentagon that I would be cutting. I cut apart the pentagons from the walnut. As long as I stayed in the cut from the CNC machine, the thickness of the walnut was almost nothing, so the cut was pretty easy. Then I could sand off that little leftover tab on the disc sander, and that went really quickly as well. I can finish putting the jig together now that I have a pentagon in place. It meant moving some of the clamps around. I decided because the jig and the clamps are a little more compact on this sled, I wouldn't put a clamp on the stop piece. And I would just have a clamp on either side of the pentagon. And that seemed to work okay. I just didn't have room for that clamp. Final piece that just holds the second clamp. So I hadn't cut off the tops of the colored pencils, thinking that that side would be facing up. It wouldn't really matter. But how the clamps work, you kind of need a flat, even surface, at least to some degree on the top. So I ended up sanding off the colored pencils on the top surface with the disc sander, which was probably easier than doing it on the CNC anyways. Then it was just a matter of cutting all 5 sides of the pentagons. And this jig does seem to work better than the old setup. I like how the edge of the cut is at the top now. And the leftover piece of the pentagon that falls away falls onto the sled, and it falls away from the blade, which is a lot safer as well. I taped all the pentagons together to make sure they were going to go together, and they did, meaning that my angles were right. I tested pin clamps in the walnut, and they seemed to work. And I tried a rubber band. I decided against the rubber bands. They're just not strong enough. I remembered that the pin clamps go all the way around the sphere, so it'd be nice to hold the sphere up. So I found a little block of wood to hold it up on. Then I felt like I was ready to glue. The gluing has to go really quickly. You have to get all the glue in, get the pieces together with the tape, and then put the pin clamps on, and the pin clamps will kind of snug everything together if the glue hasn't dried enough. So the glue still has to be fairly wet at this point. But it worked, and everything seemed to be tight and go together. So as that dried, I needed to make a way to hold the object on the lathe and the CNC machine. I think the last time I cut out circles with a hole in the center, and I glued those onto the faces of the dodecahedron. So this time I just cut out the same pentagons that I had made, and I glued a scrap piece on for the tailstock, and I glued the chuck interface piece onto the other side, which will hold the piece on the CNC machine. All of this is to make sure that the sphere ends up in the center of the dodecahedron, as I don't have a whole lot of wall thickness to spare at the corners. I started to take the pin clamps off, and it was going along just fine, and then I managed to clamp my hand with one of the pin clamps. And it's one of those things where you can't just rip it out or pull your hand away. You have to immediately disregard the pain and then concentrate on exactly the fine motor skills that you have to do to get the clamp out, which I managed to do. And that piece seems to be in good shape. All the joints are tight. And I can glue the pieces on that will hold this to the lathe. This piece will go to the tailstock, and that hole should be centered now in the object. And I can add the drive side piece. So this will go into the chuck on both the CNC and the lathe. So I'm almost ready to start turning this. I sanded off the corners just to get rid of a little bit of material so the CNC bit wouldn't get quite so deep at those points. Then I just modeled up a sphere. I think it was 8 1/4 inches in diameter, what I measured this at. And then I started with some light passes, which is basically the same G-code. I just had the Z-axis up a little bit. And then as I felt more confident about it, I lowered the Z-axis down to the center axis of the lathe and then just cut the sphere. I think this is the largest diameter thing I've done on the 4th axis, and it seemed to be fine. So I have it started on the CNC as a sphere. And what's nice about this is I can get it to something much closer to a sphere really quickly. And that'll help in the next step where I rotate this on the lathe and I hold it with a cup. And the cup will go here where the chuck is. And it now fits on that surface a lot better than if I had kind of guessed the shape of the sphere by turning it by hand. So it saves a little bit of time in the turning, but really what it does is it gets me to something that works with this much quicker. And that's really helpful. Also, it lets me turn the speed up on the lathe a lot quicker right off the start as I've removed a bunch of the mass. Also, it allows me to get the sphere right in the center of the form so I can get the most out of the wall thickness of the sphere. As at these corners, it's going to start to get pretty thin. Sounds okay now. But I can't, have the sphere like not quite centered and then one side gets too thin and I get a hole. So that's what that will hopefully prevent. The first thing to turn off is the 2 ends. So all of that work putting the pieces in place to hold this on the lathe, I now need to get rid of. And I can sort of just take off as much of that as makes sense. So I did the tailstock end first, and then I did the drive side. And you can see that I can turn this up fairly fast right off the start, which makes things go quicker. And the plan was to cut the ends off on the bandsaw, and I figured out that it wasn't going to fit on the little bandsaw. So I cleaned off the big bandsaw and got it up and running, and then looking at it, I decided that was just a little too sketchy. And I probably wasn't going to be able to hold on to that with the big blade running through it. So I put it back on the lathe, and I was just going to cut the ends off with the parting tool. And the plan was to leave a little bit in the center that I would just cut off with a handsaw, but I forgot that I had holes in the center, so I could see where the center was on both ends. So there really wasn't any material in the center. So as I got down to that void, it jumped off the lathe. Luckily, the workpiece, me, and the cameras were all fine. So I can put the cup on to hold the sphere. And it's always nice to kind of true it up a little bit each time I use it, as it tends to change ever so slightly over time, as it's wood. I can turn off the rest of the two ends. I think it looks harder than it is. It's actually pretty easy. Just a matter of going through it carefully. And then it's just a matter of turning this into a more perfect sphere. I've done videos about this before. You basically do a side and then you rotate it 90 degrees and you do another side and then you do another 90 degrees and you just keep doing that until it gets closer and closer to a sphere. And I hadn't quite cut all the way to the final depth on the CNC, so there were still a few flat spots. It did seem to be really well centered, and I didn't go all the way through the thickness of the sides at the corners. That's what I was afraid of. It's always kind of a guess as to how thick to make the pentagons, so there'll be enough material to make the sphere. And some final very light passes to try and get a good surface on the sphere. Then I can start sanding. The piece that the candle was on was right at the end of the piece of walnut, and there were some cracks in the end I hadn't seen until I cut the pentagon out. So there was one that I wanted to fill with some wood filler, which I made from glue and the very fine sawdust on the disc sander from sanding the walnut corners down. And I can do finish. Before I do finish, if I'm doing an oil-based finish, which is usually the case, it's nice to wipe the piece down with mineral spirits, and that gets the last bit of dust off. I've squirted it off with compressed air before this. Once that's dry, then I can put finish on, and I just did walnut oil. And it came out really nice. In looking at it and looking at the curve of the sphere, I do feel now like I could do the V-carving technique on a sphere. So I still want to try that. This is the part of the video where the kids had always wished everyone a Merry Christmas. And they finally decided that they've gotten a little too old for that, which I completely understand. I would have figured they'd stop doing this years ago. So I will wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And wishing everyone a great 2023. How did this get so big? It's really not going to go on the tree. Thanks for watching.